May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. It's easy to remember that Jesus was a Jew. It's easy to forget, though, that he was a Jew who regularly and intentionally crossed boundary lines in order to touch, heal, and feed. And how incendiary in its own way this was. But for us, there's no getting past it. He was well acquainted with laws and restrictions of his culture, his religion, his society, the things that set him apart as a Jew from the rest of his society, a cosmopolitan conglomeration of many peoples, many ideas about how things work. There was a way to be novel and being unique and set apart was part of what helped the Jewish people understand themselves as truly missionaries of God. So to watch a Jew openly disobeying these laws and restrictions is something. Rules and guidelines and laws are made to be observed because they help to keep order, they keep us alive, they help keep society going forward because things could easily break down or get out of hand. But as we learned last week when we heard about another version of a clean or unclean story, across a much larger canvas, rules and laws and guidelines can often become the object of their own worship. And then you're in trouble. Those who make those rules and laws and guidelines can forget why they've made them in the first place. Because sometimes our noses just get too close to the page, and we see the letter of the law, but we risk forgetting why it exists in the first place. But in Jesus Christ, God reaches out to us. God reaches out to us beyond the body of the law with a word of undeniable grace that shapes the law around it. And that word is simple and plain. I love you. God says, I will never abandon you. And I want you to be just as merciful to others as I am to you. Merciful indeed. Mark points out that the woman in the first episode of the reading that we just heard from, that she's Gentile, which is simply a word that means Greek, or in other words, not a Jew. This is a cause for caution by Mark's readers. Jesus' law says that it is outside of his orbit to even have a conversation with this woman, because if he does so, it risks making him unclean. And that presents all kinds of problems for him, not the least of which is that he won't be able to participate in religious life. But there are many other things that he will not be able to do until he can rectify the situation. That's bad enough according to the law. But the Gentile woman has a Gentile daughter who, we're told, is possessed by a spirit that is already labeled as unclean. Added to that, all this is happening in the thoroughly Gentile town of Tyre. This is not a place frequented in Mark's time by many Jews. So Jesus is healing an unclean spirit from a Gentile girl with a Gentile mother in a Gentile town. Question becomes, how far outside the law will he go to exercise love and mercy? How far outside of our established norms and rules, then, are we supposed to go in order to show mercy to others? In Jesus, God takes it to the absolute extreme. And before consenting to heal the woman's daughter, Jesus has a conversation that reveals a common expression from that time. I wonder if you heard it in the reading. Jews of his day apparently referred to Gentiles as dogs. It was just a term of slander, thoughtless, kind of what we would today call racist language. Yet, remarkably, she seizes on the term because despite what our translation says, he doesn't use the word dogs, he says puppies, which somehow softens the idea. In other words, she sees that he is seeing her. Why give food to puppies? He asks, rather playfully. Well, she says, giving as good as she gets. She says, puppies still eat the crumbs that fall off the kids' plates. And the mercy of God is extended to her without regard for her station in life. Now, if this weren't enough, Jesus leaves that place, taking a rather circuitous route, deeper and deeper into Gentile territory, and he ends up in a place that we refer to as the Decapolis, which is a group of 10 sort of loosely affiliated towns and cities out on the far eastern edge of the Roman Empire. They were known for their distinctly, thoroughly Greek culture. And it was established there that this group of towns had birthed into the world Greek scholars, Greek poets, Greek jurists over the years. It's not hard to imagine some fairly sharp hostility between the cities of the Decapolis and their Jewish neighbors to the west and their nomadic neighbors to the north. Everywhere Jesus wandered in these cities, he must have seen evidence of Greek culture, architecture, sculpture, Roman tombs, monuments, avenues, fountains, and theaters, and temple after temple where sacrifices were offered to the pantheon of gods. The non-Jewishness of it all must have been completely visible to them, kind of a finger in the eye of Jesus and his followers. I'll bet they must have tread pretty lightly, yet at least some of the time with even a feeling of disgust. Who in this place could possibly deserve to be healed? Well, as it turns out, a man with no hearing makes a good candidate. Obviously, another Gentile, another threat of becoming even more unclean. You might imagine that touching the man, as Jesus does, was forbidden. And then everything after that was beyond the pale, far beyond reasonable. Scholars tell us that spit applied to the tongue and Jesus touching the man in this way would have been considered just as defiling for him as touching human waste. Perhaps the extremism is part of the point here. Added to this, we honestly have to remember the last year and a half of our lives, don't we? We have worked so hard to keep our aerosolized particles out of other people's spaces. We're doing it right now with these masks, aren't we? And so I found myself reading this lesson this week particularly piqued and provoked and almost incensed by how intrusive Jesus is. Can you imagine Jesus offering to heal you by touching you in this way? And in the passage from Mark, of course, it's him who's risking contamination. But if he entered this room now and he offered to heal you in this way, would you? Could you? Would you let him? So by now, the people in the crowds following Jesus, I think, are asking themselves, is there any law left that this man has not violated? Any rule left in the books that he hasn't broken? I doubt most of us hearing this news today are very shocked by it. We already know Jesus to be something of a rebel. It simply remains then for us to think about how we might respond. So first of all, Jesus is on a mission of showing mercy to people. The blessing and the joy and the life and the healing of God, and it is wrapped up in these acts of mercy and kindness. Those of us who call ourselves Christians had better be prepared to lose the label unless we too can learn to go out of our way and be called out of ourselves in order to show mercy and kindness to others. Second, this mission of mercy is specifically extended and given to people who are very much unlike Jesus. The foreignness is part of the point. They aren't Jews. They live in places he's not supposed to go. They live in conditions that create real discomfort. And they have problems that he's not obligated to care about. He could live his whole life in their absence and be just fine, yet he cares enough about them, although he hasn't even met them, to go wherever it is that they are. To show the power of God, yes, but to show it to people who themselves had every right to pass him by. He crosses boundaries, left and right. He crosses and crosses them, taking the residue of one to the next place, enfolding them in this message of mercy and healing. And it isn't just some pie-in-the-sky scenario, is it? It's real and godly and very much healing written down in simple human terms, on a human scale. A daughter who is restored to sanity and a deaf man who suddenly is able to hear. Third, in the second passage, when the man is healed, he creates a ruckus of praise. He may return to his appointed daily responsibilities, but it is worth a word of thanksgiving on his lips. Doxology and love to a God who does all things well. Greek text says he makes all things beautiful. And that spreads. It's different from the praise to the pantheon of gods who demand sacrifices of grain and wine and oil, but it is a God who demands a harvest of mercy. It is a God who shows us through Jesus that rules about who is unclean ultimately pale in comparison to rules about who receives mercy and kindness. See, whoever they are, whatever they've been through, whatever situation they're in, they rise and walk and they're made whole because God sees them and loves them. Long before Jesus, the prophet Hosea channeled the voice of God saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And it is in following those words from Scripture that Jesus shows his followers what true worship really looks like.